The Appalachian Mountains are not just a geographical feature. They are a living, breathing entity that has existed long before humanity crawled out of the mud. Stretching from Newfoundland all the way down to Alabama, these peaks are some of the oldest geological formations on the planet. They have stood silent witness to the shifting of continents, the rise and fall of oceans, and the passing of civilizations that left no names behind. Because they are so ancient, they hold on to an energy that feels heavy, watchful, and undeniably predatory. When you step into these woods, you are stepping into a domain where the rules of modern society do not apply, and where the food chain is not quite what you were taught in school. There is a specific kind of darkness that falls over the deep woods of Appalachia. It isn't just the absence of light. It is a physical weight that presses against your chest. The canopy of oak and pine is so dense that it blots out the starlight, creating a sensory deprivation tank of shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Locals who have lived in these hollers for generations know the rules by heart, passed down from grandfathers to grandchildren in hushed tones. Never whistle in the woods at night, for something might whistle back. Never answer if you hear your name called from the darkness. And if you see something that looks like a man but moves like a dog, you don't acknowledge it. You turn your eyes to the ground and keep moving. Imagine you are alone, miles from the nearest paved road. The only sound is the crunch of dry leaves under your boots and the distant rhythmic rushing of a creek. You feel safe in your solitude, believing that you are the only intelligent life for miles. But then, the woods go silent. The crickets stop chirping. The wind dies down. In that sudden vacuum of sound, you realize that the silence isn't peaceful. It's a warning. The forest hasn't gone quiet because it's sleeping. It has gone quiet because a predator has entered the area. And you are no longer the observer. You are the observed. This is the reality for thousands of people who go missing or encounter the inexplicable in these mountains every year. From the Great Smoky Mountains to the Shenandoah Valley, there are stories that never make the evening news. Hikers who vanish leaving behind all their gear, experienced hunters who are chased out of their own territory by things they refuse to describe, and campers who wake up to find footprints surrounding their tents that do not belong to any known animal. The wilderness is vast, indifferent, and incredibly good at hiding its secrets. Tonight, we are not telling ghost stories. We are delving into the accounts of real people who ventured into the tree line and came back changed. These are tales of the uninvited guests that stand just outside the firelight, the mimics that learn our voices to lure us astray, and the feral things that watch us from the ridges. Lock your doors, draw your curtains, and turn up the volume. We are going into the woods, and we might not like what we find. Welcome to the deep timber, where the map ends and the unknown begins. You are listening to a collection of true, terrifying accounts from the Appalachian region and the deep wilderness of North America. These stories deal with the unsettling phenomenon known as high strangeness, events that defy logic, yet are reported with chilling consistency by credible witnesses. We will be exploring the isolation of the Blue Ridge Parkway, the claustrophobic terror of remote cabins, and the inexplicable staircases found in the middle of nowhere. The Appalachian Trail is over 2,000 miles long, and while millions traverse it safely, there is a percentage that encounters the darker side of nature. We are going to look at the psychological toll of being hunted by something you cannot see. We will discuss the feral human theory, the idea that some people have retreated so far into the wild that they have lost their humanity. We will also touch upon the uncanny ability of the forest to distort time and sound, disorienting even the most experienced survivalists. These stories serve as a reminder that civilization is fragile. We build our houses and our roads, we carry our smartphones and our GPS devices, but one wrong turn off the trail strips all of that away. Out there, you are just flesh and bone. The stories you are about to hear are not for the faint of heart. They delve into the primal fear of being eaten, of being abducted, and of simply vanishing without a trace. If you have a fascination with the macabre and the mysteries of the natural world, you are in the right place. I need you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. The algorithm tries to bury these kinds of stories, so your support by liking the video truly helps us bring these mysteries to light. Before we descend into the madness, I have a question for you. I want you to scroll down to the comments right now and tell me. Which country or state are you watching from tonight? Are you safe in a city, or are you watching this near the edge of a dark tree line? Let me know. Now let's begin the nightmare. Let's begin. This story was sent in by a viewer named Elias, and it took place in the autumn of 2022 near the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. Elias was an experienced outdoorsman, the kind of guy who scoffed at designated campsites with their power hookups and noisy neighbors. He preferred dispersed camping, hiking miles off the beaten path into the raw wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains to find true solitude. He wanted to disconnect from the modern world, to reset his mind in the silence of the old-growth forest. He found a spot about 4 miles from the nearest trail, a small, flat clearing near a rushing creek, surrounded by towering hardwoods that were ablaze with the colors of fall. The first day was idyllic. He set up his tent, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon fishing in the creek. As the sun began to dip below the ridge, the temperature plummeted, and the forest transformed. The friendly orange and red leaves turned into a wall of gray and black shadows. Elias cooked his dinner over a small fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound competing with the water. By 9 p.m., the darkness was absolute. The canopy was so thick that it blocked out the moon, leaving him in a bubble of firelight. He was reading a book, feeling completely at peace, when the atmosphere shifted. It started with a sound from down the ridge, perhaps 100 yards away. Whistling. It wasn't the random noise of wind passing through a hollow log. It was a distinct melodic tune. Elias lowered his book, straining to listen. The tune was familiar. It was Yankee Doodle. The whistling was slow, deliberate, and pitch-perfect. Elias felt a cold prickle of unease on the back of his neck. He was 4 miles deep in the woods. No casual hiker would be navigating this terrain in pitch darkness without a flashlight, and he hadn't seen a single beam of light all night. He sat perfectly still, his hand hovering over the knife he kept on his belt. The whistling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Elias waited for 10 minutes, then 20. Silence. He convinced himself it was his imagination, a trick of the auditory senses caused by isolation. He extinguished his fire, plunging the campsite into darkness, and crawled into his tent. He zipped the sleeping bag up to his chin, trying to force himself to sleep. An hour later, he was drifting off when the sound of footsteps snapped his eyes open. Crunch, 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 heavy bipedal footsteps. This wasn't the erratic scuffling of a raccoon or the 4-legged gait of a bear or deer. This sounded like a man wearing heavy boots, walking with purpose. The footsteps were circling his tent. Elias grabbed his hunting knife, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps stopped directly behind where his head was resting. He could hear breathing, a wet, rattling sound, like someone with fluid deep in their lungs. Then a voice spoke. It didn't yell. It whispered, right against the thin nylon fabric of the tent, inches from his ear. "Hey, Elias, are you awake?" Elias stopped breathing. It wasn't just that the stranger knew his name. It was the voice itself. It sounded exactly like him. It was his own voice, mimicked perfectly in pitch and cadence, but with a slight metallic distortion, as if it were being played back on a degraded cassette tape. Elias clamped his hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. The voice spoke again, more insistent this time. "Elias, come outside, the fire is warm. Come look at the moon." It was a trap. Every instinct in his body screamed that if he unzipped that tent, he would be dead. The thing outside, whatever it was, paced back and forth, dragging its feet through the leaves. Occasionally, it would let out a giggle, a low, guttural sound that didn't match Elias's voice at all, breaking the illusion. The psychological terror lasted for what felt like hours. Elias sat in the center of his tent, knife shaking in his hand, praying for the sun. Eventually, the footsteps walked away, the crunching of leaves fading into the distance up the ridge. Elias didn't sleep. The moment the gray light of dawn broke through the trees, he packed his gear in a frenzy, leaving behind some of his cheaper equipment just to move faster. He practically ran the 4 miles back to his truck, constantly looking over his shoulder. He never reported it to the rangers. What could he say? That he heard himself trying to lure him out of a tent. Elias hasn't been camping since. He believes there are things in the Appalachians that have evolved to hunt humans, not by strength, but by deception. Privacy is a luxury we often take for granted, but in the wilderness, privacy can be an illusion. This next story comes from a couple, Noah and Sarah, who thought they had found the perfect getaway in the mountains of West Virginia. They found a listing for a remote cabin on a local rental board. It was cheap, secluded, and promised a digital detox with no Wi-Fi and no cell service. The owner, an older man who lived in the next town over, left the key under the mat and told them they would have the mountain to themselves. The cabin was rustic but charming, perched on the edge of a steep ridge overlooking a valley of dense pine. For the first 2 days, it was paradise. They hiked, drank wine on the porch, and enjoyed the total silence of the woods. But on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the illusion of solitude was shattered. Noah was walking the perimeter of the property, gathering kindling for the wood stove, when he noticed something odd on a tree about 50 feet from the back of the cabin. It was a trail camera, camouflaged and strapped high up on the trunk of a thick oak tree. Trail cameras are common in rural areas for tracking deer populations, so Noah didn't panic immediately. But as he looked closer, he realized the angle was wrong. It wasn't pointed at a deer trail or a clearing. The lens was angled downward, pointing directly at the master bedroom window of the cabin. A knot of anxiety formed in his stomach. He found a long stick and managed to shimmy the camera loose from its strap. He took it back inside, his hands trembling slightly, and inserted the SD card into his laptop. There were thousands of photos. The first few hundred were innocuous: raccoons, squirrels, the occasional fox. The timestamps dated back months. But as he scrolled to the end of the gallery, the blood drained from his face. The photos changed. They were no longer of animals. They were of Noah and Sarah. There were photos of them arriving in their car, photos of them unloading their bags, photos of them eating dinner on the porch. The camera had been triggered by their movement every single time they stepped outside, but the true horror was in the final batch of images. The photos switched to the grainy, green-tinted black and white of night vision. There was a photo of Noah sleeping in the bed, then a photo of Sarah sleeping, then a photo of both of them, taken from the foot of the bed. Noah stared at the screen, his brain struggling to process the geometry. The camera he found was outside, strapped to a tree. But these photos were taken from inside the room. He checked the timestamps: 2 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 4:30 a.m., last night. Someone had entered the cabin while they were deeply asleep, stood over their bed in the darkness, taken photos of them, and then, for some twisted reason, had taken the SD card or the camera back outside and mounted it on the tree. Or perhaps they had swapped the cards. The logistics didn't matter. The violation was absolute. They were not alone. "Sarah," Noah said, his voice barely a whisper, "pack the bags. Right now. Don't ask questions. Sarah saw the pale terror in his face and didn't argue. They grabbed their essentials, leaving food and clothes behind, and ran to the car. As Noah fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking violently, he looked up toward the tree line where he had found the camera. Standing just at the edge of the woods, half hidden behind the trunk of a massive pine, was a figure. It was a man, dressed in dirty, mismatched camouflage gear that blended almost perfectly with the forest floor. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was just standing there perfectly still, watching them with a blank expression. He didn't run. He didn't try to stop them. He just watched. Noah slammed the car into reverse and sped down the dirt road, risking the suspension on the potholes. They didn't stop until they reached a gas station 20 miles away to call the police. When the authorities investigated, the man was gone. However, they found signs of habitation in the crawl space underneath the cabin: a rolled-up sleeping bag, food wrappers, and a peephole drilled through the floorboards looking up into the bathroom. The stranger hadn't just been watching from the trees, he had been living beneath them the entire time. This final story for this segment touches on a phenomenon that has become something of an internet legend, often discussed in park ranger forums and deep web threads: the stairs in the woods. While many dismiss these as creepypastas, there are surveyors and forestry workers who swear they are real. This account comes from a land surveyor named Mark, who was working in a remote section of the Chattahoochee National Forest in Georgia. Mark's job involved trekking into areas of the forest that recreational hikers never see. He was marking property lines and checking topography for potential conservation efforts. He was used to finding weird things in the deep woods: old moonshine stills, rusted cars from the 1940s, piles of animal bones. But what he found on a humid Tuesday in April defied all logic. He was about 6 miles from the nearest service road, pushing through a dense wall of rhododendrons, when he stumbled into a small, perfectly circular clearing. The grass in the clearing was knee-high and yellow, which was strange for spring, as everything else was vibrant green. But it was what sat in the exact center of the clearing that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a staircase. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't the crumbling stone foundation of a burned-down house. It was a pristine, fully carpeted staircase. It looked as if someone had used a giant knife to cut a staircase out of a suburban home and simply dropped it into the middle of the wilderness. It had a polished wooden banister, clean beige carpeting, and white trim. There was no dirt on it, no leaves, no bird droppings. It was immaculately clean. It led to absolutely nothing. It just climbed 10 feet into the air and ended in empty space. Mark remembered hearing stories about these structures and the one rule associated with them: never touch them and never climb them. But looking at it in person, his brain couldn't reconcile the object with its environment. It looked high definition, almost hyper-real, contrasting sharply with the organic chaos of the woods. Against his better judgment, he felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to climb it. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical pull, like a magnet dragging the iron in his blood. He took a step forward. Suddenly, the forest went silent. If you spend time in the woods, you know that true silence does not exist. There is always the wind, the rustle of leaves, the buzz of insects, or the distant hum of a plane. This was different. This was a vacuum. The air pressure dropped so rapidly his ears popped. The smell of pine and wet earth vanished, replaced by a sharp metallic scent, like ozone or old pennies. He froze, 1 foot raised to take the first step. Every survival instinct in his reptilian brain screamed, "Predator." He looked up at the top of the stairs. The air above the top step was shimmering, like heat haze on a highway in summer. And in that haze he saw something. It looked like a hand, pale, elongated with too many joints, reaching down from the empty air, waiting for him to take the handrail. The spell broke. Terror, hot and primal, flooded his system. Mark turned around and ran. He didn't check his compass. He didn't check his GPS. He just sprinted through the underbrush, tearing his clothes and scratching his face, running until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. When he finally stopped, collapsing against a tree, the sounds of the forest rushed back in all at once. The birds, the wind, it was deafening. He checked his GPS. He was 4 miles away from the clearing, in the completely opposite direction of his truck. He looked at his watch. It was 4 p.m. He had stumbled upon the clearing at 1 p.m. He had lost 3 hours of time, but physically, he felt like he had only been running for 20 minutes. Mark never went back to finish that survey. He told his boss the terrain was too unstable and refused to return to that sector. He doesn't know what the staircase was or where it led, but he knows one thing for sure. Something was waiting at the top, and it was hungry. The deep woods have a way of playing tricks on your mind, but sometimes the tricks are dangerously real. This next account comes from a former park ranger who worked in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. He asked to remain anonymous for reasons that will become obvious once you hear what he encountered. In 2015, he was on night patrol, a routine shift that involved driving the service roads and checking for illegal campfires or distressed hikers. It was a Tuesday night, dead quiet, the kind of silence that usually brings peace. But around 11:30 p.m., a call came over the radio. A group of campers at a designated site near Big Meadows had reported a disturbance. They didn't elaborate, but the dispatchers said they sounded frantic. When the ranger arrived, the campsite was empty. The fire was still roaring, casting long, dancing shadows against the trees. A pot of chili was bubbling on the grate, boiling over and sizzling into the ash. The tents were unzipped, sleeping bags laid out, and backpacks were leaning against logs. It looked like the occupants had simply evaporated mid-dinner. He shouted, announcing himself as a federal ranger, but his voice just died in the thick, humid air. That's when the whistling started. It wasn't a tune like in the previous story. It was a signal. A sharp, 2-note whistle from the north. Then, immediately, an answer from the south. Then, another from the east. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he was being triangulated. Whatever was out there was coordinating. He drew his sidearm and backed toward his truck, scanning the tree line with his heavy mag light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and leaves, until it landed on something standing just beyond the perimeter of the campsite. It looked like a man, naked and emaciated, crouching on all fours like a dog. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bone. The creature or person tilted its head, opened its mouth, and let out that sharp, piercing whistle. It wasn't a human sound. It sounded like a flute made of bone. The ranger didn't wait to ask questions. He jumped into his truck, slammed the door, and locked it. As he fumbled to put the truck in gear, 3 more figures emerged from the darkness, moving with a jerky, unnatural speed, rushing the vehicle. He floored the gas, tires spinning in the gravel, and sped away. As he looked in the rearview mirror, red with the reflection of his taillights, he saw them standing in the road watching him leave. The campers were never found. Their gear was collected, and the official report listed them as missing under suspicious circumstances. But the ranger knows the truth. They were hunted. And the pack is still out there. There is a phenomenon in the Appalachian folklore often referred to online as not deer. These are encounters with animals that look like deer, but move, act, or look wrong in a way that triggers a deep biological revulsion. This story comes from a hunter named Caleb in eastern Kentucky. Caleb had been hunting the same patch of family land for 20 years. He knew every creek, every ravine, and every game trail. He was sitting in his tree stand about 15 feet up a white oak, waiting for the sunrise. It was that gray, hazy hour of the morning where shapes begin to form out of the darkness. He heard the distinct sound of hooves walking through dry leaves. He readied his compound bow, expecting a buck he had been tracking on his trail cams. Emerging from the rhododendrons was a deer, but it was wrong. It was too big, for one. Its proportions were off. The legs were too long and thick. The joints looked swollen. Its fur was patchy, looking like it had mange, but the skin underneath was a sickly gray rather than pink. Caleb held his breath, watching it. The deer didn't graze. It didn't sniff the air. It walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, lifting its knees too high with each step, almost like a human trying to walk on tiptoes. It walked right to the base of the tree Caleb was sitting in. Then, it did something deer physically cannot do. It stood up on its hind legs. It didn't rear up like a horse. It stood flat-footed, balancing perfectly, its back straightening out. It was tall, its head reaching almost halfway up the tree stand. Then, it looked up. Deer eyes are on the sides of their heads, giving them panoramic vision to spot predators. This thing's eyes were on the front of its skull, like a human, like a predator. And they were intelligent. Caleb froze, his hand gripping the bough so hard his knuckles turned white. The creature stared at him, unblinking. Then, its jaw unhinged, dropping unnaturally low, and it let out a sound that sounded like radio static mixed with a woman screaming. It wasn't a bleat or a grunt. It was a noise of pure chaos. Caleb dropped his bow. The noise startled the creature, or perhaps it decided it had scared him enough. It dropped back down to all fours with a sickening crack of its joints and bounded away into the thicket, moving with terrifying speed. Caleb stayed in that tree for 6 hours until his brother came looking for him. He never hunted that land again. He says the way it looked at him wasn't with fear. It was with recognition. Technology is supposed to be our tether to safety, but in the deep woods, electronics often glitch in ways that suggest interference from something other than bad reception. This story comes from a search and rescue SAR volunteer named Jessica, who operates in the Great Smoky Mountains. SAR workers have some of the most disturbing stories because they are the ones looking for the people who vanish. Jessica was part of a team looking for a 6-year-old boy who had wandered away from a picnic area near Klingman's Dome. The terrain was rugged, full of drop-offs and dense vegetation. It was day 2 of the search. The optimism was fading, replaced by the grim reality of survival statistics. Jessica was separated from her partner by about 50 yards, sweeping a grid near a rocky outcrop. Her radio, clipped to her shoulder, had been silent for an hour. Suddenly, static cut through the silence. It was a harsh, rhythmic static like breathing. Jessica grabbed the radio. "Base, this is Jessica. I have traffic. Over." The static cleared for a second and a voice came through. It was a child's voice. "Mommy? It's cold." Jessica's heart leaped. "Base! I have the subject on the channel. He has a radio." She assumed the boy had found a dropped radio, or perhaps was near one. She yelled into the mic, "Buddy, this is Jessica. Can you hear me? Keep talking so we can find you." The voice came back, but the tone had changed. It was still the child's pitch, but the inflection was flat, robotic. "It's cold. It's cold. Below the roots. Below the roots." Jessica sprinted toward where she thought the signal was strongest. "Base, are you copying this?" she screamed. The dispatcher came back confused. "Copy what, Jessica? The channel is dead air. We haven't heard anything." Jessica stopped running. She held the radio up. The child's voice came through again, but this time it dissolved into a low, guttural laugh that sounded like an adult man. "He's cold. He's mine." The radio then let out a high-pitched squeal and died completely. The battery, which had been fresh that morning, was drained. They found the boy 3 days later. He was found 5 miles away from Jessica's location and 12 miles from where he vanished, a distance impossible for a 6-year-old to cover in that terrain. He was found in a small cave, tucked deep into a crevice. He had died of hypothermia on the first night. When they recovered the body, they found his clothes were missing, neatly folded and stacked on a rock outside the cave. There was no radio found with him. Jessica resigned shortly after. She still hears that laugh in the static of her car radio when she drives through the mountains at night. The Appalachians are honeycombed with cave systems, many of which are unmapped and unexplored. While the surface is dangerous, the underground is a different world entirely. This story comes from 2 amateur spelunkers, Mike and Dave, who were exploring a cave system in Kentucky, not far from Mammoth Cave but unconnected to the main tourist routes. They were looking for Virgin Cave, passages that no human had ever set foot in. They found a small, tight opening behind a breakdown pile of rocks and squeezed through. The passage opened up into a large room, the ceiling soaring up into darkness. Their headlamps cut through the gloom, revealing stunning formations, stalactites, flowstone, and soda straws. They were ecstatic. This was a major discovery. They pushed deeper, marking their path with reflective tape. After about 2 hours, they reached a section where the cave floor became wet mud. As they walked, they heard a sound. Slap, slap, slap. It sounded like wet bare feet hitting the stone. They stopped. "Is there someone else down here?" Mike whispered. It was impossible. The entrance was hidden, and they hadn't seen any other cars. They shined their lights down the tunnel. About 50 yards ahead, the passage turned sharp left. The slapping sound was coming from around that corner. It stopped. Then, slowly, a head peeked around the corner of the rock wall. It was pale, hairless, and had no nose, just 2 slits. But the eyes were the worst part. They were large, reflective, and glowed a deep, luminescent red in the beam of the LED lights. But they didn't blink up and down. They blinked sideways, like a lizard's nictitating membrane. The creature stared at them, its hands gripping the rock wall. Its fingers were impossibly long, with extra joints. Mike and Dave didn't scream. The terror was too absolute. They just turned and scrambled back the way they came. As they ran, they heard the slapping sound behind them, getting faster, closer. It was chasing them. They squeezed through tight crawls, tearing their suits and skin, panic making them clumsy. They could hear the thing breathing behind them, a clicking, chittering sound. They made it to the entrance squeeze and practically threw themselves out into the daylight. They collapsed on the forest floor, gasping for air. When they looked back at the hole, they saw nothing but darkness. But in the mud around the entrance, there were prints. They looked like human handprints, but the fingers were 6 inches long and tipped with claw marks. They covered the entrance with rocks and deadfall and never told anyone where it was. Some doors are meant to stay closed. We think of trees as stationary objects. They are the background, the scenery. But in the deep folklore of the Appalachians, there are stories of the forest moving when you aren't looking. This final account comes from a solo hiker named Ben, who was attempting a section hike of the Appalachian Trail in Maine, the famous 100-mile wilderness. It is the most remote section of the entire trail. Ben was 3 days in, miles from civilization. He set up camp in a pine grove. It was a clear night, and he slept with the rain fly off his tent so he could see the stars. He woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. When he opened his eyes, he was confused. He couldn't see the stars. He looked up through the mesh of his tent and saw only blackness. He grabbed his headlamp and turned it on. A wall of bark was pressing against the mesh of his tent. Ben recoiled, scrambling to the center of the tent. He shined the light around. He was surrounded. Massive pine trunks were pressed tight against his tent on all sides, boxing him in. He knew for a fact that when he set up camp, the nearest tree was 10 feet away. He had specifically chosen a clearing. Now, it was as if the forest had inhaled, constricting around him. He could hear the wood groaning, a deep, resonant creaking sound like a ship in a storm. The roots were moving beneath him, shifting the earth under his sleeping pad. He felt like he was being digested. Panic set in. He grabbed his knife and slashed the side of the tent. He squeezed out through the slit, scraping his skin against the rough bark that shouldn't have been there. He squeezed between the trunks, fighting his way out of the circle. When he broke free into the open trail, he spun around with his light. The trees were still. They looked like normal trees, but they were clustered in a tight, unnatural knot, right where his tent was crushed. He didn't go back for his gear. He hiked through the night with just his headlamp and his knife, terrified that if he stopped, the woods would catch up to him. When he reached the next shelter the following day, he told a ridge runner what happened. The runner didn't laugh. He just nodded and said, "Yeah, the woods get lonely. Sometimes they want to keep you." Ben got off the trail at the next road crossing and hitchhiked home. He says he still has nightmares where he wakes up and the ceiling of his bedroom has turned into a canopy of pine needles, lowering slowly to smother him. The Appalachian Mountains are a place of breathtaking beauty, but they are also a place of profound mystery. The stories we've shared tonight, of mimics, of feral humans, of creatures that dwell in caves and forests that seem to move on their own, are just a drop in the ocean of high strangeness that plagues this region. Skeptics will say these are just hallucinations brought on by isolation, fatigue, or fear. And perhaps for some, that is true. But when you look at the consistency of the reports, the sheer number of people who describe the exact same phenomena without ever meeting each other, you have to wonder. Is it possible that in the oldest mountains on Earth, there are pockets of reality that work differently? Is it possible that we are not the apex predators we think we are when we step off the pavement? The wilderness demands respect. It demands caution. And most of all, it demands that you listen to your instincts. If the woods go silent, if you feel eyes on your back, or if you hear a familiar voice calling your name from the darkness, don't investigate. Don't be a hero. Turn around and leave the way you came. Because out there, you are only a visitor, and some hosts do not want you to leave. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark. If you have your own story from the Appalachians or the deep woods, please leave it in the comments below or send it to the email in the description. Your story might be the next one to warn others. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to explore the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, keep your flashlight batteries fresh, and never ever whistle in the woods at night. Good night.